There is a detail buried inside this ceasefire that almost nobody is talking about. On April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week truce. Pakistan brokered it. The headlines celebrated. Markets exhaled. Crude oil futures dropped almost a full percentage point within hours. And for a brief moment, the world believed the worst was over. But here is what got buried underneath all of that relief. Iran walked into that truce holding cards that Washington did not expect it to have. Not nuclear cards, not missile cards, geography cards. See, while the American Navy was enforcing a blockade that the Pentagon claimed had cut off 90% of Iran's seaborne trade, Tehran was already moving goods overland through 7 different countries. Trucks were rolling through Pakistan. Cargo was crossing into Turkey. Shipments were reaching Uzbekistan through a corridor that did not even exist 6 months ago. So the question I kept circling back to, the question that made me dig into this story, is simple. Did the United States actually pressure Iran into this ceasefire? Or did Iran use the ceasefire to buy time while it quietly rebuilt its economic lifelines on land? Because if you look at what has happened in just the last 2 weeks alone, the answer is not what most Western media outlets are telling you. To understand why this ceasefire matters, you need to understand what preceded it. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran. The strikes were massive. They killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. They killed Ali Larijani, who had been one of the key figures in back-channel negotiations. They destroyed military infrastructure, government buildings, and, according to Lebanese authorities, killed at least 1,400 people across the region, including 57 health workers in Lebanon alone. Iran hit back. Hard. Missiles struck Israeli cities. Drones targeted American bases across the Gulf. And then came the move that changed everything. Tehran shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I want to be specific about why that matters. Roughly 20% of the world's oil exports pass through that narrow waterway. When Iran closed it on March 2nd, the IRGC did not just block tankers. They struck vessels. The US-flagged Stena Imperative was hit at port in Bahrain. A port worker died. Insurance companies pulled war risk coverage by March 5th, which meant ship owners would not send vessels through, even if they wanted to. By March 10th, only 15 ships had made it through. 15, in a waterway that normally handles dozens of transits per day. The economic damage was staggering. The International Monetary Fund cut its global growth forecast to 3.1% for 2026, down from 3.3% in January. Oil prices hovered near $100 a barrel. And Iran, which depends on sea trade for roughly 90% of its economy, was supposedly being strangled. That was the narrative Washington was selling. That the blockade was crushing Iran into submission. That Tehran would have no choice but to come to the table. But Iran was already at a different table entirely, and it was dealing a hand that had nothing to do with the sea. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where I think most coverage has completely missed the point. While the world was fixated on the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's Interior Minister Eskandar Momineh issued quiet instructions to every governor along Iran's border provinces. The directive was blunt: use every available resource to expand cross-border trade immediately. Push imports of essential goods. Push exports of local products. Do not let daily life be disrupted by maritime pressure, and they had the geography to back it up. Iran shares land borders with 7 countries: Iraq, Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. It trades with Russia and Kazakhstan through the Caspian Sea. Routes that had been economically secondary for decades were suddenly treated as frontline economic infrastructure. But the real masterstroke came from Pakistan. On April 12th, Pakistan officially launched a brand new transit corridor. The route runs from Gwadar port through Iran and into Central Asia. The first shipment, frozen beef in refrigerated trucks, reached Tashkent, Uzbekistan, under the International TIR custom system, which allows sealed cargo to cross multiple borders with minimal inspections. I want to stress how significant this is. This corridor did not exist before the war. Pakistan activated the border crossings at Taftan, Rimdan, and Gwadar specifically for this purpose. Islamabad also relaxed export rules, allowing food, medicine, and supplies to flow through the route. Analysts at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad directly linked this corridor to the improving relationship between Pakistan and Iran after Islamabad's mediation role in the ceasefire. So what Iran effectively did was turn a maritime blockade, a tactic designed to isolate it, into a catalyst for building permanent overland trade infrastructure. The sea was blocked, so the land carried the load. And the land routes are not going away when the ceasefire ends. That is not the behavior of a country being forced into anything. That is strategic adaptation in real time. Now, let me walk you through the diplomatic side, because this is where the pressure dynamics become even more revealing. The first round of talks happened in Islamabad on April 10th, led on Iran's side by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Those talks failed. Ghalibaf told reporters that Iran had raised forward-looking initiatives, but the American delegation had not earned Tehran's trust. 3 sticking points derailed the negotiations. First, Iran's nuclear program. Washington demanded zero enrichment and full removal of highly enriched uranium. Second, the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. wanted an unconditional reopening. Third, compensation. Iran demanded reparations for wartime damages, something Washington was never going to agree to easily. But here's what I find telling about the power dynamic. On April 11th, Vice President J.D. Vance flew to Islamabad alongside Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Think about that for a moment. The Vice President of the United States traveled to Pakistan to negotiate with Iranian officials. Vance himself described the ceasefire as a fragile truce, not a victory, not a deal, a truce. Meanwhile, Iran was simultaneously playing the Lebanon card. Tehran insisted from day one that the ceasefire included Lebanon. Israel and the United States both rejected that interpretation. Netanyahu explicitly said Hezbollah would need to be dealt with separately. But on the ground, Hezbollah was already testing that boundary, launching rocket attacks on the border town of Metula and triggering sirens in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Ashdod. According to Channel 13 in Israel, officials admitted privately that they were under heavy pressure from Washington to agree to a ceasefire in the north. The political security cabinet was locked in intense discussions, and voices from northern Israeli communities were furious, arguing that battlefield gains against Hezbollah were being traded away under foreign pressure. Iran was not just negotiating for itself. It was negotiating on behalf of its entire regional network. And that gave it leverage that no blockade could neutralize. Now, I know some of you watching this are going to push back and say, hold on, Iran's economy is in ruins. The blockade is costing them $435 million a day. Their infrastructure has been bombed. Their supreme leader is dead. How can you call this a win? And that is a fair challenge. I am not arguing that Iran came out of this war unscathed. The damage is real. The casualties are real. Over 4,000 people have died across the region, overwhelmingly in Iran and Lebanon. But here's the distinction I am drawing. A military loss and a diplomatic win are not mutually exclusive. Iran absorbed catastrophic blows and still managed to shape the terms of the ceasefire. It got Pakistan to mediate on its terms. It forced the conversation to include Lebanon, even though Washington rejected that formally. It built trade corridors that will outlast this war. And it used the Strait of Hormuz not as a weapon of war, but as a bargaining chip so effective that the US president himself described Iran as doing a very poor job of reopening it, which tells you Tehran was controlling the pace, not Washington. That is not losing. That is surviving and repositioning. So where does this go from here? The ceasefire expires on April 22nd. Negotiators are racing against that deadline. Reports suggest both sides have given an in-principle agreement to extend the truce, but the U.S. has not formally confirmed that. The core issues, enrichment, the Strait, reparations, remain unresolved. But I want to make a prediction, and I want this channel to be held accountable for it. I believe the Strait of Hormuz will not fully reopen under this ceasefire, and I believe that is by design, Iran's design. There are reports that Tehran has actually lost track of some of the mines it planted in the waterway, which means even if Iran wanted to fully reopen the strait tomorrow, it physically cannot do so quickly. The U.S. Navy has already begun mine clearing operations, which tells you Washington knows this too. What I think is actually happening is that Iran is deliberately keeping the strait as a slow-release pressure valve. Every day it stays partially closed, global markets feel it. Every day it stays partially closed, the economic argument for a deal that favors Iran grows stronger. Meanwhile, the land corridors are becoming permanent. The Gwadar to Tashkent route is projected to generate $2 to $3 billion annually for Pakistan alone. Iran's borders with Turkey, Iraq, and the Caspian states are seeing increased traffic. Geography is being converted into economic infrastructure that did not exist before February 2026. So the real question is not whether the ceasefire holds. The real question is whether Iran has already achieved what it needed from this war. Not through missiles, not through proxies, but through maps, trade routes, and the patience to let a blockade become its own kind of leverage. That is the story nobody is telling you, and that is exactly why it matters.